So let's get started. We have been talking about the God kind of faith. Remember last week we talked about how Paul was laying out a case in the first 10 chapters of Hebrews as to why Jesus Christ is the ultimate and complete sacrifice. He's the Messiah who did a complete work, a finished work. Unlike the Old Testament priests, he didn't have to go daily to atone for the sins of the people and for himself. His sacrifice was once for all time, sufficient to cover the sins of all humanity. As long as we are willing to receive his sacrifice. In Hebrews chapter 11, the writer begins to lay out the specific examples of faith in order to verify his case and why faith is so powerful. So in the chat, you're going to see, if you haven't seen it already, the list of scriptures that we're going to try to go through today. Now, I know last week I had the presentation board up and all like that, but you know what? I didn't really like it, only because I wasn't able to see your faces. I love to look into your beautiful faces.
Okay. You say it's in the chat?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know how to operate the chat.
Okay. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. It's like a line of icons.
It's empty, Miss Helen.
Oh, is it?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Click. Do you have a little icon that says participants at the bottom at all?
Yes.
Okay. Then two icons over, do you have what it says chat? That's not there?
I'm in the chat. It's empty. Yeah.
Huh. Okay. Let me just copy these and I'll put them back in again. I don't know why it did that, but we're going again. Okay.
There you go.
It popped up this time?
Yep.
Okay. Good.
Auntie, you want me to send it to you?
Yeah, because it just goes right away before I get my pen to the paper.
Oh.
I don't know how to operate this yet.
Okay. Well, let me just speak them out to you then, Doris.
Well, Leah can just text it to me. Oh, she just sent it to my phone.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, of course, we're going to be spending time over the next several weeks in Hebrews 11. Okay. The first is going to be Genesis 1, 1 and 2, Romans 8, 24, Genesis 4, 3 through 10, Genesis 5, 32, Genesis 7, 6, and Genesis 8, 13. Now, we do know, starting with the first verse, is something that we talked a little bit about last week, a description of faith. Does anyone want to read it? Hebrews 11:1 for me, please?
Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Yes. Things hoped for. Now, the writer lays this phrase to let us know that there's a tension between what we see with our physical eyes and what we see with our spiritual eyes. There is obviously something in existence that our physical senses is not discerning, but does exist. So let's look at Romans 8:24 and see what that writer has to say about hope.
For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. who hopes for what they already have.
Now it's strange because he's saying if we're saved in this hope, and we are, and he's talking about the hope of salvation, but hope that is seen is not hope. In other words, if it's evident, if it's visually able to be seen, then it's not something that we need to consider obtaining because it's right there before our eyes. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's take a look at that word hope. Our hope is the constant expectation of an unseen reality, something that is not apparent yet. The dictionary defines hope as, as a desire with expectation of obtainment or fulfillment, promise, confirmation. In other words, our desire is aimed towards something that exists, whether we see it with our eyes or not. Because if it did not exist in some form somewhere, it would not be in your heart. Does that make sense? The very fact that it is in your heart as something to be desired says that it can be obtained and that it exists, even though it may not be in your hands at the moment. So if I was going to paraphrase that verse in Hebrews 11:1, it would be something like this. Now, faith is a substance of things of which we have an absolute promise and confirmation of, the evidence of things which presently exist in an invisible reality, but will become visually apparent in time and eternity. It presently exists in an invisible reality, but will become visually apparent in time and eternity. And the examples that the writer goes on to cite in the rest of Hebrews chapter 11 will bear this out. So let's take a look at verses 2 and 3 in Hebrews chapter 11.
Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen.
That's right. He says that faith is so important that it was by faith that people of old earned the approval of God. They received the approval of God. And then he starts at the very beginning. And he goes to creation story. Let's go to Genesis 1 and 2. Because we want to make sure that this writer knows what he's talking about. He's making a strong statement here. That the worlds were framed not with brick and mortar, but by words, the words of God. So whoever has that can read that. Genesis 1 and 2.
In the beginning, God created by forming from nothing the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, or a waste and emptiness, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, primeval ocean that covered the unformed earth. The Spirit of God was moving, hovering, brooding over the face of the waters. It's the Amplified version.
Thank you. Yes. Out of nothingness, he created not just this earth, this planet, but everything that we see in existence in the skies. Now, our focus is on this planet, but we see the amazing event of how God spoke into existence that which did not exist before. And once he spoke it, and it came into the visual reality, then that became the evidence that what God had in mind, what he hoped for, came to be. Did you ever stop and think that God had hoped for something? Yeah, God had faith. He had faith in his own word. He knew when he spoke, it would be. He had that confidence and assurance in his own character. Yes, he's sovereign. But he knows that when he speaks something, it comes to pass. Not simply because he could do it, but because he's God. And we need to recognize that when we have faith in him, that same type of assurance that he's going to follow up on his word, then our faith will be just like this. Let's move a little further. We're going to start to look at some of the old patriarchs and prophets. So if someone would give me verse 4, yes, just verse 4 first. Hebrews 11:4.
Okay. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks.
He being dead still speaks, the writer says. So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 10. We're going to examine that incident between Cain and Abel.
Give me a second, guys. I'm trying to find it. Don't everybody speak up at once. Okay, you said 4, 3 through 10?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. 3 through 10. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up?" And if you do not do well, sin is the crouching at the door. And its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain told Abel, his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground."
Mhm. Yes. Now, the writer in Hebrews said that because of Abel's excellent sacrifice, God was testifying of his gifts. And through it being dead, he still speaks. This whole incident between Cain and Abel, and the reality that Abel brought the appropriate sacrifice and then was murdered. This is the first murder. And God says something very interesting. He says, the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. That word, that verb that we translate as cries, he wasn't talking about just then, but it's a continuous. It cries out and continues to cry out to me from the ground. But as much as it does, Abel's sacrifice stands so that God is relating his sacrifice to all the generations that would come after, even to us. This wasn't just 2,000 years ago. This was thousands of years ago when this incident took place. And God is still testifying that Abel gave the great sacrifice. Don't you know that when you give whatever the sacrifices that God calls of you, that he will continue to testify to it through your life? Abel's life was cut short by this, but what he did lives on and is a testimony to us. That's another facet of faith. God has commended him. It doesn't say that Abel was baptized or that he did a prayer walk or that he fasted 8 days out of the week. He simply honored God through his life, his everyday living, giving God the appropriate sacrifice. And as a result, what he did stands today. God's bragging on it, just like he brags on you. So I'm going to share something with you. I was going to go to the next verse. The Holy Spirit said to share this. Now, do you ever wonder if what you do for God is noticed or makes any sense? The smallest things can have the greatest impact. And it'll be beyond. Later on in Hebrews, we do talk about some of the impacts of those who went before us made. But in this instance, God wants you to see that what Abel did, Abel had no idea that what the impact of his sacrifice would be on us today. He never imagined us. He never knew of our existence, but God knew. How many of you have ever heard of Billy Graham? You could say the whole world knew of Billy Graham. Did you ever know how he came to walk into his calling and do the things that God had assigned him to do? He didn't just jump up and do it. There was a whole process that started with one man doing something that he thought would impact the kids in his care because he had faith. So I'm going to read you something. Have you ever heard of a man by the name of Edward Kimball? Most people haven't. I dare say that for most people, even while he was alive, they never really knew him. But Edward Kimball was an Oak Park, Illinois Sunday school teacher who not only prayed for the hyper boys in his class, but also sought to win each one to the Lord personally. He decided he would be intentional with every single last one of them. Surely he thought about throwing in the towel, dealing with a bunch of boys in a Sunday school class, most of whom don't want to be there. But if you have ever taught the Bible to young boys, you know that the experience can often be like herding cats. One young man in particular didn't seem to understand what the gospel was about, so Kimball went to the shoe store where he was stocking shelves and confronted him in the stockroom with the importance of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That young man was Dwight Moody. Have you ever heard of Dwight L. Moody? Okay. In the stockroom on that Saturday, he believed the gospel and received Jesus Christ as his Savior. In his lifetime, Moody touched 2 continents for God, with thousands professing Christ through his ministry. Not done yet. The seed is not done. The story doesn't end there. It's where it begins. Under Moody, another man's heart was touched for God, Wilbur Chapman. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Chapman became the evangelist who preached to thousands. One day, a professional ball player had a day off and attended one of Chapman's meetings, and thus Billy Sunday was converted. Have you ever heard of Billy Sunday? He was a very popular evangelist. Sunday quit baseball and became part of Chapman's team. Then Chapman accepted the pastorate of a large church, and Billy Sunday began his own evangelistic crusades. He converted thousands. Another young man was converted under Billy Sunday, whose name was Mordecai Ham. He was a scholarly, dignified gentleman who wasn't above renting a hearse and parading it through the streets, advertising his meetings. When Ham came to Charlotte, North Carolina, a sandy-haired, lanky young man, then in high school, vowed he wouldn't go near him. But Billy Frank, as he was called by his family, did eventually go. Ham announced that he knew for a fact that a house of ill repute was located across the street from the high school, and that male students were skipping lunch to visit the house across the street. When students decided to go to interrupt the meetings of Mordecai Ham, Billy Frank decided to go to see what would happen. That night, Billy Frank went and was intrigued by what he heard. Returning another night, he responded to the invitation and was converted. Billy Frank eventually became known as Billy Graham, the evangelist who preached to more people than any other person who ever lived, including the Apostle Paul. Billy Graham, they approximated over the lifetime of his preaching ministry, not his whole life, but just over the lifetime of his preaching ministry. And you include radio and TV, as well as the live events in which he was physically there. Preached to over 2 billion people. Now, when we look back, and this is over a span of years, starting with Edward Kimball. Edward Kimball lived from 1823 to 1901. Dwight Moody lived from 1837 to 1899. John Chapman lived from 1859 to 1918. Billy Sunday lived from 1862 to 1935. Mordecai Ham lived from 1877 to 1961. And of course, Billy Graham lived from 1918 to 2018. That one act of faith by Edward Kimball, to have the desire that the boys in his classroom have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, ended up in the modern world hearing an evangelist who spoke the gospel of Jesus Christ to more people than they could count. This one man's faith, for one thing, God honored that faith just as he did Abel, and it speaks today.
Miss Helen, can I get those names one more time, please?
Yes, Edward Kimball,
Kimbell.
Ball.
Ball. Okay.
Dwight L. Moody.
Dwight Moody.
Yes, Dwight, Dwight, Moody, Moody. Then it was John Wilbur Chapman. Then Billy Sunday. His last name is spelled just like the day of the week.
Okay.
Mordecai Ham.
Hand or Hann?
Actually, it's Ham, just like the pig.
Oh, Ham. Okay. Okay.
And then, of course, Billy Graham.
Billy Graham. Okay. Thank you.
Your faith may seem small, inadequate, unimportant, but God says not so. Your faith, just to do your part, is explosive and can have an impact on the world that you never dreamed of. And I dare say that when the time comes and you stand before the Lord and you may wonder, or you may think, well, Lord, I'm just glad to be here. And when he tells you, well done, he may ask you to look over your shoulder to see all the people who you brought along you didn't even know, because you did what you were asked to do. And like Edward Kimball, you may look behind you and see more people than you could ever number, having no idea of the impact. And that is what the writer of Hebrews is talking about. Let's go to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis 5:32. And if someone will read to me verses 5 through 7 in Hebrews chapter 11 while we look for that.
Okay, I have Genesis 5:32. Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And Hebrews 11, verses 5 through 7.
It was by faith that Enoch was taken up to heaven without dying. He disappeared because God took him. For before he was taken up, he was known as a person who pleased God. And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who comes to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him about things that had never happened before. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith.
Thank you. Enoch, who was living in a world that was becoming more and more violent, more and more sinful, more and more craven, his life stood out because he had a relationship with God and was determined to do the things that were acceptable to the Lord, to live upright. His life stood out. And God had such affection for him that in the midst of a conversation, he decided he didn't want to end the conversation. He wanted Enoch to come closer and simply took him home. He didn't go back to his tent or his house. He went to God's house. Can you imagine how much affection God had for him? How much he enjoyed his conversations with him? That he didn't want to end the conversation. But his life was a testimony of faith. That in a world that discounted God, he believed God. In a world that wanted to say that God's word didn't mean anything and that God was far removed, his life testified to the reality that God was present. He pleased God. And so then we move to Noah. Noah was Adam's great-grandson. And between the time that sin had caused them to be cast out of the garden until the time of Noah, the world had fallen in such deep darkness. And God was looking for someone to take on this special assignment. You know, Methuselah was still there. But Methuselah, this was not the assignment God wanted to give him. But he found Noah. And Noah had grace. It says that Noah, being divinely warned, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark. And so when we look at verse 5 in Genesis, Noah was 500 years old. That's pretty well up in age, isn't it? But that tells us, too, that age doesn't mean anything to God. Your faith is all that matters to God. So while the world tells us, well, the world says, give me your best years, and then whatever you have left over, if anything, then you can spend time doing what you want. Dedicate it to God then. Your leftovers. But God says not so. You're not about to sit in a rocking chair and wait until your end comes. He said, you've got something to do. And I can give you the strength and the wherewithal to do it if you trust me. So let's even look a little further. Genesis 7:6.
And it says Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth.
Let's look at Genesis 8:13.
By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry.
Thank you. Noah's act of obedience. For the years it took him to build the ark, he stayed on task, despite what anyone said, believing God that what had been unthinkable, impossible, and never before seen was going to take place, became his act of faith, his testimony of God's greatness. Now, can you imagine God coming to tell you something that you would think is totally improbable is going to happen, but wanting you to be an integral part of it? And everybody around you, everybody who knows you, government officials, principalities and powers, all saying no and declaring you to be foolish, and a fool, crazy. And you're building this vessel nowhere near water. And you do it step by step, day by day. 1 year passes, still building. 2 years pass. 10 years pass. 30 years pass. 100 years passes by. And you are taking the scorn of everybody. And not just you, your wife, your family, all of you being scorned. But you believe God, as improbable as it is. And then the day comes when you are enclosed in what you have built for God. And now really the test comes. Because after all those years, it's another 7 days before it starts to rain. You're shut up with all these critters. You and your family only. Day 1. Day 2. Day 3. Nothing happening. Day 4. No overcast skies. Day 5. 7 days. And then everything breaks loose. That faith, he didn't have to preach to anybody. That faith, the demonstration of walking out his faith, became the testimony to God and against the whole world. We're living in a time where God is calling for that kind of stand. That's why faith is so important. But it's got to be the God kind of faith. We're going to start next week with verse 8. Verses 8 through 12 in Hebrews 11. And we'll see that God is going to do some supernatural things, even more so through people. who stood on faith. Remember the verse 1. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The substance, the certainty of things that we have an absolute promise for. The evidence of things which presently exist in an invisible reality, but which in time will become visually apparent, even unto eternity. The things that these people did that we've talked about this morning, they weren't immediately apparent, but they have stood up in time and eternity so that we become witnesses to the substance of their faith. Any questions or comments?